This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This week on Off the Record, we've got your election news, out with the old, in with the new, as Mecklenburg County voters clean house on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board. In Raleigh, Republicans get their supermajority, not in the legislature though, but on the state Supreme Court instead. And how will North Carolina House and Senate races affect the balance of power in Washington? Also, CMS looking, again, for another interim superintendent and also a permanent superintendent. More on the job that nobody seems to want. And speaking of schools, looks like students are coming back to K-5 campuses that lost enrollment during COVID. Plus, the county supports studying new toll lanes on I-77, but will City Hall support an underground transit center that costs twice as much as putting it above ground? Lots to talk about next. PBS Charlotte. And from our PBS Charlotte studios in historic Plaza Midwood, I'm Jeff Sonnier, and we're off the record talking about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, and listen to the news, well, you'll recognize the names and faces around our virtual table. Tony Messia from the Charlotte Ledger, Will Wright from the Charlotte Observer, and Anna Maria Della Costa from the Charlotte Observer. You can also join the conversation at home or from your phone. Just email your questions and comments to offtherecord at WTVI.org. Well, an election day that was different in a lot of ways, I suppose. We had, national races on the ballot for U.S. Senate and House, but the most attention here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, I suppose, was on that little school board race that was there to begin with because of the COVID issues the last couple of years with elections. A lot of changes on the school board. I've been here since 1980, and I don't recall any one election where so many newcomers were elected as a group. Who wants to start us off this week on what we saw happening, that changing of the guard on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board? Anybody?
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think voters were loud and clear that they want change on the school board. Obviously, 3 of 4 incumbents gone. I think the other thing that was interesting was you have 3 people that came on in Lisa Klein, Melissa Easley, and Dee Rankin, who have education backgrounds, teachers. And I think that also speaks to what voters wanted. They want teachers to have a voice on the school board. And, teachers have been saying ever since COVID, before COVID, they want to be heard. So I think you saw that play out on Tuesday night.
Yeah, and Jeff, this is really an unusual election for the school board. This election was supposed to take place last year, got pushed back by a year because of census delays. But, usually these are small turnout elections. Here you had a U.S. Senate election at the top of the ticket and a whole bunch of other races, including the school board. So, I don't know how many voters turned out for one of the marquee races and then got to the school board race and said, I don't know these people. So the dynamic is a lot different. The districts were different than they were in the most recent election. You had a lot of drama. I don't know that there's necessarily a clear mandate because the incumbents that lost were sort of all over the ideological spectrum, and they're replaced by people all over the ideological spectrum. So we're going to have a majority of newcomers on the school board, but is it going to change a lot of the dynamics? I don't know. I think the hope would be you have some new people with fresh ideas.
Yeah, let's recap. We had 6 seats up for grabs, and 5 of the seats were taken by newcomers, either from incumbents running for re-election and losing, or from incumbents who decided not to run at all. So we essentially have a newcomer majority on the school board. And you were talking about the educational backgrounds of some of the newly elected school board members. 4 out of 5 of the newcomers elected are all current CMS parents, and the 6th is a parent who's got kids who graduated from CMS. So I'm wondering, are we seeing maybe something new in terms of parent power? We saw political groups organized representing parents outside the normal political parties. We saw the NCAE's recommendations, endorsements, for the most part, half of them were rejected by voters. Is there something else going on here besides just the simple school board election when it comes to parents wanting more control over their schools and who's representing them?
necessarily know if that's the case, but I mean, I do know Summer Nunn was one of her biggest things on her platform was she's one of the only ones that still has kids in elementary school, and she wanted to be that elementary school voice on the board. I think there's something to that, but I'm not sure if it's just a lot of parent power. I just think they just want different faces and people who are maybe a little bit closer to the ground in the school system. I just really get that vibe.
Yeah, when you're a parent, it changes your perspective, I suppose. And I heard that from a couple of candidates that the experience that the existing board members had or have is not the same as someone who's, as you mentioned, has elementary school kids or a child that's a third grade reader and they're talking about third grade reading scores. I mean, it gets a lot more personal for parents who have kids in school being affected by some of these issues that the schools are being affected by. And I wonder if that changes the decision making, because we've got some big decisions coming up for this new school board, and a lot of newcomers will be, dipping their toe into the political side of the CMS for the first time in a meaningful way. Do you think these newcomers shift the direction that the board's been going in the past? And do you think it'll affect, for example, the choice of a new superintendent going forward?
I mean, I think you just have a bunch of different people with a bunch of different perspectives on there. I mean, obviously, if you have different people on there, they could make different decisions. But again, I don't think that it's not like you have, one particular ideological element in control of the school board. I think the dynamics of, the mix of people endorsed by, teachers groups and on one side and the sort of, Moms for Liberty types, on the other side, I don't think changes a whole lot. So, obviously the hiring of the superintendent is going to be, one of the main things on the plate of these new school board members.
Yeah. We'll come back to the superintendent search in a few moments. One last quick question about the school board election. A couple years ago when City Council saw a lot of millennials getting elected, they talked about it being a millennial city council. Is that what we're seeing now with school board? I mean, the changing of the guard. We're not necessarily seeing all youngsters, if you will, being elected, but we certainly are seeing people, getting into politics for the first time. And I don't know if that's a shift that's going to happen on all elected boards eventually, but we certainly saw it happen in a big way on Tuesday night, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, on a night when a lot of incumbents won and a lot of favorites won, this was the race that really stuck out, that you had 3 of 4 incumbents fall. And, we've seen that across the country over the last several months, as it relates to school boards, all over the place. So, but yeah, I mean, most incumbents won, most of the favorites won, except for the school board race. So it sort of makes you scratch your head and say, okay, what was up with that? Are there special circumstances there? Yeah.
I've heard people say, parents, they love their schools, they love their teachers. They don't necessarily love their leadership at CMS. So to the new school board members, be careful what you ask for, because you might just get it, and good luck over the next 3 years. As you mentioned, Tony, you're not the only race on the ballot that night, but certainly the most interesting one. But in Raleigh, some changes with a shift back towards the Republicans and close to what they were hoping for, and that's a super majority. Will, what's your impression on what happened Tuesday night and how that affects the state lawmakers going forward?
Yeah, it was a good night for Republicans. Maybe not the perfect image of a night in the sense that the Republicans did not get a supermajority in both chambers of the state house. They got one in the Senate. In the House, they came up one short. There are still, put a small caveat on that, still less than a handful of races that are close. For example, in Cabarrus County and Concord, that race is there's still a possibility that Echevarria, the Republican, could come ahead, but it's unlikely, but it is still possible. But running on the assumption that doesn't happen, there is still came up one seat short in the House. So Governor Roy Cooper's veto should still be effective. And the other big race, obviously, is the Supreme Court. Yeah, Republicans now have control of the North Carolina Supreme Court, and that will make a huge difference when it comes to redistricting in particular. these congressional maps that we have, for example, having Jeff Jackson winning in South Charlotte and out to Gastonia, those maps are not going to be around for the next election. It's unlikely. So that will be a huge difference maker for sure.
Yeah, the supermajority gives any party that's got it, but in this case, the Republicans, opportunities to, to do things without the threat of a veto. Obviously, that threat is there, but even if it wasn't there, that Supreme Court can overturn some of those decisions, and we've seen that in particular in the gerrymandered maps. It's kind of a green light. I mean, in some ways, winning the Supreme Court supermajority is probably a bigger deal on those issues than having the supermajority in the legislature, right?
Right. Yes, and I think that everyone's eyes were on the U.S. Senate race. And, in Republican Ted Budd winning is a big victory for Republicans because it was expected to be a close race. But I think among insiders, probably the Supreme Court was their higher goal. Having Ted Budd in the Senate maintains the status quo of North Carolina's representation in that chamber in Washington. Having the Supreme Court will make a big difference for, 8 years or 6 years rather, going forward.
Yeah, and it's not just the maps that will be affected either. There's a lot of issues that are possibly in the pipeline over the next few years that could result in court cases that new Republican Supreme Court will decide. I mean, it goes beyond just what the legislature says yes to or no to. It gets to what the Supreme Court says yes to or no to, and that there's no veto power on the Supreme Court. It's, once they make that decision normally stands.
Yeah, I mean, on state issues, especially in the other area that you're going to see besides redistricting is, school funding. The Leandro case, it's been going on for almost 30 years, guaranteeing the right of a sound basic education for students in North Carolina. There have been a lot of battles on that. The existing Supreme Court, dominated by Democrats, I think it's 4-3 Democrats, came out with a decision last week saying, okay, you need to fund education in North Carolina, but that could, so now there are questions, well, how does that stick around? Does that, are you able to, is the new Republican court able to undo that decision? So, like Will said, a lot of different issues potentially on the docket there.
Yeah, I mean, Leandro was a 20-year-old court case that was decided, 2 or 3 days before the election. So it makes you wonder if Democrats maybe saw the writing on the wall and were hoping to make a decision among those 4 justices that were in office right before the election that may or may not stand up when the new justices, the Republican majority, takes over. A lot of, they say, the judicial, it's not political. It's not supposed to be political, but it's extremely political here in North Carolina when it comes to a lot of key issues, I suppose. Hey, I saw a story this morning in the Observer about, it talked about the countrypolitan voter. I mean, and how Democrats are still having problems, not necessarily in the big cities, but in the counties just outside the big cities. And I guess we kind of saw that in this election, in almost every election this cycle, when it comes to those justices, the almost supermajority at the GOP level, the U.S. Senate race. Talk a little bit about how, what Democrats are doing wrong when it comes to, winning some of those races, and whether demographics changing will result in a political change long term. Anyone want to tackle that quickly?
I think you might see parts of the surrounding counties in Mecklenburg become more blue as time goes on. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing now very likely a Democrat representing Cabarrus County, or part of Cabarrus County. But I think it would take a long time for, Gaston or Union or the rest of Cabarrus County to flip blue. But that said, when you're running these statewide races, like for Supreme Court, for U.S. Senate, Democrats have to do decent, at least in rural areas. You can't just rely on Mecklenburg, Durham, and Wake counties to get you a victory in North Carolina and the other Democratic strongholds across the state. But as far as what they're doing wrong, I believe they're trying to figure that out. But we'll see if their strategies are going to be effective. But they're going to have to do something differently, I think, to be reliably successful statewide.
Yeah, well, if you know what they're doing wrong, you can make a lot more money, right? We all could. Hey, you mentioned the U.S. Senate race. I guess we have to mention it as well, since it was front and center for most of this campaign. I guess the win by Ted Budd over Sherry Beasley shows that, at least in North Carolina, a Trump endorsement still makes a difference, not just in the party, but maybe among the voters as a whole. That was a little different here than it was in a lot of other states across the country on election night, right?
Yeah, I don't know how much Trump's endorsement played into it. I'm sure it definitely had an effect in the primary. I'm sure it had an effect getting some of the base out for Representative Budd. But Trump's presence in this race was fairly limited.
Right.
I mean, he came and visited once to campaign for Budd. That said, you're right. I mean, Ted Budd won by a decent little margin there, and I'd be curious, going forward, what Trump's role is. I heard from some local Republicans that they thought that Trump's involvement and his presence in the party had them lose seats in Mecklenburg they were hoping to flip. Like
really?
Bill Brawley was running for a seat in Mecklenburg County. There were a handful of other races that they were supposed to be close-ish, and actually fairly close, and they lost those. And so it's unclear how moderate Republicans and unaffiliated voters in South Charlotte, other places in Mecklenburg County, are going to react to Trump's presence going forward.
Tony?
Yeah, I mean, for all the talk that we just had about Democrats having problems in sort of the exurban counties, you see Republicans having trouble in suburban areas of Mecklenburg. You look at that Matthew Ridenour, Laura Meyer race on the county commission, South Charlotte district. Republicans were hoping they could sort of break into the county commission. It's a completely Democratic county commission at the moment, but Ridenour, a Republican who's served as a county commissioner before, lost that race, even though this is a sort of suburban type of district. So you are seeing continued troubles, I think, by the Republican Party in attracting some of these suburban voters. How much of a Trump effect that is, I think, is sort of an open question.
Yeah, Ridenour was a popular ex-county commissioner trying to get his old seat back, and you would think that would be about the best opportunity the Republicans certainly had this time around, and maybe might have for a while, because he was a guy who voters had chosen before, but not this time around. By the way, as you mentioned, the Mecklenburg County Commission stays all Democrat, and the Mecklenburg delegation in Raleigh, all Democrats except for one. John Bradford won in House 98, which means there will be at least one Republican talking with the leadership on behalf of the city and county for funding issues like the transit tax and that sort of thing going forward. I don't know if that helps or hurts, or if one is enough, but there is at least one Republican speaking on behalf of or talking with the leadership in Raleigh, while the Democrats sometimes don't talk with Republicans on issues like this. Hey, let's go back to schools, shall we? 2 days after the school board election, we're now searching for another interim superintendent. Hugh Hadabaugh stepping down for personal reasons. Anna, you're smiling. You've had a busy week. You want to talk a little bit about the timing of that and the surprise factor of Dr. Hadabaugh leaving?
Sure. First of all, I read something this morning, and I want to make it clear. I talked in depth with him yesterday. He was not pushed out in any way, shape, or form. They adore him. He brought a lot of stability, or brings a lot of stability. He's still on the job until December 31st. It's something that he had been thinking about for a few weeks. He has an ailing father who lives in Indiana. He's 98 years old and refuses to go into a nursing home. And Hugh said, he's the lone person to take care of him. And also his wife really wants to go back to Florida. So Hugh just thought it best to step down. And, he said it was probably about 80% or 90% personal reasons, about 10% where, there were some, personality issues here and there on the board, which of course you're going to have. I mean, he has 9 bosses theoretically. So, that's something that's going to happen, but he's going to be missed the short time that he was here. He really kind of I wrote about it today. There's just no BS. He's just a straight shooter. This is what we need to do. This is how we need to get there. And I think that he should be the blueprint of what the new board should be looking for moving forward for a permanent superintendent. Obviously, there's going to be an interim now for about 6 months, but I really think their sights seem to be set on a permanent.
Yeah, we had 8 months of stability, but what comes next? I mean, that's the question. That stability was welcome after some of the instability we've seen over the past couple of years, but it does kind of leave the incoming board, the system itself, in a lurch when it comes to, some of the changes that have been implemented, some of the direction that the board is and the school system is taking right now. Are we going to see? I mean, how do you reclaim that stability that Hadawal brought to the table?
I think they're going to look internally for an interim. And I think that's going to help because he put some people in place and kind of set a direction. So I think if you keep it internal, that is key to kind of carry that on. And like I said, it's really now setting your sights on a permanent. And they've been saying all along they want to wait until January, until the new board is seated, that needs to really start in earnest here in the next month.
If you're a fourth grader right now in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, you've had 3 superintendents since you started school. You'll have at least 1 more before the end of this school year, maybe 2 more. That just kind of gives you a sense of how quickly things, that carousel spins when it comes to the new superintendent. And again, with a new school board majority on board for this next choice, it'll be interesting to see if they what they're looking for and who they may choose coming up next. Tony, you wrote a little bit about. I'm sorry, go ahead, Tony.
Jeff, if I can cut in on that, I think it's also going to be interesting what sort of people they get applying for this.
Yeah.
I think CMS has a reputation of having high turnover in this job, and are you able to get the top tier type of candidates that you want after all the turnover that we've had and superintendents? Now, you do have a number of very highly qualified people internally who could take over, on an interim basis. You might recall that before Hugh Hadawal came in, Scott McCulley, who had been with the district for a while, left and came back. He was interim superintendent, I think, for 2 days, something like that. So, you probably see something like that in the short term. But longer term, who do they get to apply for this job? And do you have somebody? Is there another Hugh Hadawal out there?
Right. Yeah. I guess we'll find out over the next couple of months. That's one of the first big issues that the new board will tackle. One of the next big issues after that is something you wrote about this morning, Tony, and that's possible new districts down in South Charlotte, redrawing the lines of where students will be going to school in the future with new high schools. Talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot on the plate. Even though they're looking for a new superintendent, the work of CMS goes on in doing a lot of the things that they want to do. You have issues on school safety. You have the search for a new superintendent, and one of the things is student assignment. CMS looks at student assignment lines and boundaries every few years. There's one that's going to be really coming up in the next couple months that is going to get a lot of attention, I think, and that's because CMS has under construction a new high school in the Ballantyne area. It's actually in the South Mecklenburg zone, but that's going to cause a ripple effect of student assignment really throughout most of South Charlotte in the Myers Park, Ardrey Kell, and South Mecklenburg zones. That's a huge zone where parents are notoriously very engaged in school assignment decisions. And so it's just some of those details are just starting to kind of leak out. But that's certainly going to be a big focus, I think, over the next couple months.
Yeah, anytime you try to redraw the lines on schools that you're happy with now, it certainly brings out crowds and it certainly brings out criticism. That new board has its work cut out for it, obviously. One other quick school thing, CMS enrollment up in K-5 schools down in South Charlotte. That's a reversal from what we saw during COVID, right?
Yeah, we saw during COVID in 2021 or 2020 and 2021, you saw big exits from elementary schools in South Charlotte. They led CMS in enrollment drops as people turned to homeschooling, private schools, those sorts of things. Looking at the enrollment numbers that CMS put out last month, you can now see that those enrollment drops have stopped. CMS had predicted that a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. They said they thought after COVID students would return, and it looks like they are, or at least they're not leaving in the same numbers that they that they used to. So, overall, the district's numbers, we think of Mecklenburg County as a growing county, but CMS's enrollment numbers have been largely flat the last couple of years. There was a drop during COVID, still below our peak in the 2015 to 2019 time frame. So, parents, I think, feel like they have options, and some of them are exercising that. But I think it's good for CMS to have some stability in enrollment.
Yeah, we got about a minute left. Two quick things. County Commission this week endorsed studying a plan for new toll lanes down to the state line on I-77. That's not a final decision. In fact, we may have another decision coming up this coming week, and we'll probably talk about that next week on this show. But the transportation center, $90 million if it's underground, $45 to $55 million if it's above ground. Seems like an easy decision, except Katz likes the more expensive one. Can we? Anybody want to just weigh in very quickly about that?
Yeah, so the city's been working with a developer. They want to put offices and retail and the Hornets practice center on that site. And so the developer's preference is to have the bus station underground. That seems to be the direction that the city council is going to. That's the recommendation from Katz. But there's some questions on how that would work, how much that would cost, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no final decisions on that yet, and it'll be interesting to see how council members react to the high-cost plan that Katz seems to like right now. Again, another topic for another show. There's always another show, and I want to thank you all for joining us on this one. If you're watching at home, remember, you can always join the conversation as well. Just send your comments or questions to offtherecord@WTVI.org. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time right here on PBS Charlotte.
A production of PBS Charlotte.